Okay, so thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So we want to think about settlement in this paper and what kind of frictions come with settlement. So how does decentralized settlement look like? So users broadcast transactions to a network of nodes, and then these transactions get collected in a public mempool where everybody can see them. So in that sense, it's very different from traditional securities settlement. And the miners, or the settlers in this case, have complete discretion about which transactions to pull from this mempool, and also in which order they settle transactions on the blockchain. So a key insight is that also that anyone with a node, so meaning anybody who wants to run a node, can see what transactions are waiting in this mempool and potentially trade on that. So this leads to a problem of minor extractable value, or maximum extractable value, as it's sometimes called more recently. And this can obviously lead to expropriation. So somebody looks at a pending transaction in a mempool and say, well, I can slide my transaction in before that trade. I can rearrange these transactions in the mempool in a way that profits me, that makes everything better for me. So there's obviously the idea that you could front run other traders and try to be ahead. So miners themselves are also potential traders, and they could exploit the trades of other people. So if some arbitrage bot, for example, found a great trading opportunity, the miner can look at that before settling it and say, well, I can do the same trade and pocket the money myself instead of letting somebody else take the profit, and therefore you can see that miners can exploit arbitrage bots. So this whole discussion was started by this a very influential article on Medium, was this Dark Forest article, where they presented Ethereum more or less as a dark forest, where there's other agents out there who try to come after you and take advantage of your transaction. So in the computer science literature, there's a rich set of papers that looks at minor extractable value, and they try to quantify how big is minor extractable value, and there's a concern about how will this affect consensus stability, and very often also there's research in computer science coming on this, where they try to find ways and algorithms to overcome the problem of minor extractable value. I don't want to go through that in detail in the interest of time. There's a paper in the finance literature where the authors compare the lit trading value to private settlement, and that draws an analogy to this literature on dark pools for traditional financial trading, where you can choose between trading on an exchange or in a dark pool. And this paper is mostly about settlement, the question, will you get your transaction settled or not, versus our paper focuses more on what are the fee implications. So what we want to argue is that some of this trading we see, some of these arbitrage transactions are actually socially very desirable. So if you have different prices on different decentralized exchanges on the blockchain, that is not very good from a financial perspective, because as a trader, then you have to be worried about which exchange do I trade on if I have different prices. So arbitrageurs fulfill the socially desirable role of bringing these prices back together and aligning prices in different markets. Another socially desirable application would be to liquidate under-collateralized loans. So in DeFi lending protocols, it is on the broad user base to police loans that are under-collateralized and liquidate those loans. And that is fulfilling a socially desirable function, because we need those loans to be liquidated, and somebody has to do that. So these are bots that are out there fulfill this task to protect the platform. A little bit of a questionable application, but we would argue is still socially desirable, is to exploit weaknesses in DeFi code. And we see these exploits happening, sometimes very spectacularly, but in a way that's the private sector solution to a government regulator imposing a fine on a bank that misbehaved. Here we have the blockchain taking care of this, and members, users, arbitrage bots exploiting weaknesses in code and then inflict a punishment. Now, some arbitrage trades are socially inefficient, something like, for example, front running. If I want to trade and then I want to buy some tokens, an arbitrage bot comes in and buys those tokens before I purchase them and sells them immediately after I've bought them. That would be socially undesirable. So in traditional finance, settlement is done by utility and is pretty boring. So in DeFi, we have the miners who are strategic and who can trade. We have orders being visible before being processed. And we have also the need for these arbitrageurs to come in and discover trading opportunities because they fulfill a socially desirable task. So in our paper, what we want to look at is how does MEV affect the incentives of the arbitrageurs to perform this socially important task of bringing prices back together, and also how does MEV affect the fees for other users. So you can think that if miners make some money from exploiting arbitrage bots from this miner extractable value, that could potentially cross-subsidize transactions of ordinary users, or it could lead to a situation at least where the optimal fee that the miner sets is different or is now affected by this additional opportunity to make money. And so we want to look at that and explore this a little bit more. And finally, we want to look at what is the welfare implications of this. Very often people argue that MEV is bad and that we should try to avoid this, but we not necessarily agree with this point of view, because a lot of the arbitrage transactions are socially desirable. And if MEV creates some kind of efficient way to promote more of this socially desirable arbitrage, then this would be in the interest of everybody and welfare could potentially be improved. So let me walk you a little bit through the model that we have in mind. So we have a profit maximizing miner who charges a fee for including a transaction. There's one transaction processed each period. The user could either be a regular user or an arbitrageur who puts the transaction. So a regular user just has some kind of private value for transacting on the blockchain, and they will only participate if that private value exceeds the fee. So the fee will play an important part here, because if the fee is too high, a lot of these users just get priced out of the market. And that is, again, socially not desirable. We want to encourage a lot of participation in the blockchain, and so having a lower fee has some social benefit. The other type of agents that post transactions are arbitrageurs. So they can search for arbitrage opportunities. Searching for these arbitrage opportunities is costly, so there's a certain cost associated with that effort. And if they put more effort in, they have a higher chance to find this arbitrage opportunity. And the arbitrage opportunity has some kind of value R that is then found with probability E. So if they don't find an arbitrage opportunity, these arbitrageurs, they submit a private value trade. The last type of agents in our models are screeners. So screeners are agents that can try to find these arbitrage opportunities. So the screener goes and searches for these trades that the arbitrageur posts and says, well, can I front run this arbitrageur? Can I somehow exploit this? So the screeners, again, invest some kind of screening effort and then have a cost to do the screening. And with some, depending on the effort, E, S, they get the probability to expropriate the trading opportunity of the arbitrageur. So screening can be done by either independent agents out there, or screening can be done by the miner. And part of what we want to look at is, how is screening better done by independent screeners out there, or is there some benefits when the miners do the screening? So first we want to look at what is the socially desirable outcome. So what would a social planner do? The social planner looks at the value that comes from these private trades. So if there's some private value to be realized, the social planner wants to do all these private value trades. There's some socially desirable arbitrage that the social planner wants to take care for. The social planner also wants to process the private value trades from the arbitrageur. So if the arbitrageur does not find an arbitrage opportunity, and the social planner also takes into account the costs that the arbitrageur has for finding these arbitrage opportunities. So the main trade-off for the social planner is essentially to say, what is the most cost-effective amount of effort that the arbitrageur should put in? How hard should the arbitrageur look for these trading opportunities? Now, a social planner would not do any screening, because screening is not really providing any social value. The screeners just, in a way, take money away from the arbitrageur. So this is just a pure transfer. There's no value creation in screening. So first, we want to look at a public settlement where the screeners and arbitrageurs exert some effort, and then either you find an arbitrage opportunity or you don't find it. If you don't find it, you have a private value transaction. If the arbitrageur finds an arbitrage opportunity, submits that trade to the mempool, and then with some probability, you get expropriated by the screener. So that's about, I think, the last slide with math on it. So what is the arbitrageur's problem? The arbitrageur tries to find the optimal amount of effort to put in to search for these arbitrage opportunities. So what is the miner's problem? The miner's problem is to collect as much fee revenue as possible. Now, why is this a non-trivial problem? So as we can see, the incentive for the arbitrageur to look for, does this have a little pointer on it? To look for arbitrage opportunities is in part influenced by the fees. If I know that I have to pay a very high fee, I'm not going to look so hard for these arbitrage opportunities. The last part that's important is the screener. So the screener tries to find those transactions that the arbitrageur has found and tries to expropriate the arbitrageur. So again, the fee is important here, because the screener says, well, if I'm going to expropriate the arbitrageur, I have to pay a cost to finding these opportunities, and then I also have to pay a settlement fee to get my transaction settled on the network. So if that settlement fee is very high, the screener is not going to look so hard for opportunities. Now, the problem gets complicated because the screener then sets the optimal screening effort, which in turn affects the incentives for the arbitrageur to look for transactions in the first place. So the arbitrageur knows that there is a screener out there who might screen and expropriate his transaction. So the miner has to take all this into account and figure out, well, depending on how I set the fee, this will change the incentives of the screener, and this will, what the screener is doing together with the fee will affect the incentives of the arbitrageur to look for arbitrage opportunities. So the screener's effort is decreasing in the fee. The arbitrageur's effort is decreasing in the fee as well, and decreasing in the screener's effort. So nobody here in this kind of model takes into account the social value of the trades. And so the question that we want to look at is, how close do you come to the first best outcome? So here's the miner's profit as a function of the fee that you post for an example. So here we see that in green is the fee from the ordinary users. if you set the fee very low, then you don't make any money from fee revenue. If you set the fee too high, then you price out all these ordinary users from the market, and these ordinary users don't participate. So if you just look at the ordinary users, there is an optimal fee level that maximizes the revenue for the miner. Now in orange is the minus profit that comes from the arbitrageur. And the arbitrageur's effort here is overall increasing in the fee. So despite the fact that the arbitrageur finds it less profitable to search for opportunities when the fee is higher, what also works is that the screener does not find it as profitable when the fee is higher. So in part that there is less screening when the fee is higher, which is again good for the arbitrageur. So the arbitrageur is not as much affected by the fees. And so we see that the minus overall profit, which is the blue line, therefore is maximized when the fee is relatively high. So what we do see, if there is this opportunities out there to screen, then the fees are high, many users are excluded from the market, and the screeners put too much effort in to expropriate the arbitrageurs. So what happens if the miner is actually the screener? So I don't want to walk you through the math, but what happens is that the miner now also makes the screening profits. So the miner makes extra money from optimally screening, and the miner now understands that they want to incentivize the arbitrageur to look for opportunities, because now the miner is making the screening profits, but if nobody looks for arbitrage opportunities, there is no money to be made from screening. So now the miner optimally sets a lower fee to encourage the arbitrageur to look for trading opportunities, and then tries to expropriate the arbitrageur to make some money. So this is better from a social planner's perspective, because now if the overall fees are lower, that means that more users participate in the blockchain, and that creates some social benefit. So this is socially valuable. So take away from this that miners are the better screeners, and this leads to overall improvements. So what we've seen in industry, and the last kind of settlement mechanism that we want to look at is the rise of direct interfaces where you can submit transactions for private settlement. So MEV-Geth was released in 2020 and by a group called Flashbots, and they want to create a system where you can submit private transactions for settlement. So how does this work? You go to the miner and say, well, I would like to mine this transaction. I don't want to send it to the public mempool. I'll send it directly to the miner. And I negotiate a fee with the miner and say, I'll pay you directly, and please settle my transaction. So this is a private market. It's structured as a first price auction, and the arbitrageurs somehow split the proceeds of the trade with the miner. And in the settlement process, the transaction never becomes publicly visible, but directly ends up on the blockchain. So here what we have to decide is, do we go to the private? The arbitrageur needs to decide whether to go to the private market or the public market. If you go to the public market, you could be screened. If you go to the private market, you cannot be screened, but you pay a fee to the miner. That is potentially different. So the miner sets an offer for the private market, and how should we think about the economics of this private settlement? So the arbitrageur should strictly prefer to go to the private market. But if the arbitrageur goes to the private market, there is no incentive for the screener to screen, because now all the arbitrageur's trades go through private settlement, so they never show up in the mempool, so there's nothing to screen. So if nobody screens, then the arbitrageur would go to the public market and pay a lower fee potentially. So that cannot really be an equilibrium, right? Because if the arbitrageur would always go to the private market, then there's nothing to screen. But if there's no screeners, then the arbitrageur would like to go to the public market. So that cannot work out. So how does this work? So the miner would have to set a very high fee. The ordinary users would get priced out. So this doesn't really work. So this is not really an equilibrium that's sustainable. So the only way that we can sustain an equilibrium in this private settlement market is if the miners are also the screeners. So the miners have to screen the mempool. They know that they're not going to find very much in the mempool, but the main reason why the miners screen the mempool is just to deter the arbitrageur, to say, you better come to the private market, otherwise we will find you and we'll screen you. So the screening is just there as an empty threat that the arbitrageurs have to go to the private market. So the miner then has to do enough screening to deter the arbitrageur from going to the public market. The miner can extract some of the surplus from the arbitrageur. So this is good for the liquidity traders because now the miner can essentially price discriminate and say to the arbitrageurs, I charge them one price and they come through the private market, and the ordinary traders, they go through the public market and I charge them a different fee. So this way the miner can price discriminate, and this is good for the ordinary users because now they pay a competitive fee in the public market, and therefore participation in the blockchain is high. So what we argue is that actually MEV is not such a bad thing. These private settlements, flashbots, is actually providing some benefits because it will reduce the fee that the miners charge in the public market. So this graph shows you for an example, what the optimal fee is as a function of the value of the arbitrage. So the blue is the public market and orange is the private market. So what we see is that the fee declines dramatically if we have this flash box market around. And why? Because again, the miners extract some of this value in these private transactions, and they essentially subsidize the fees for the public market to encourage more participation of the users in the public market. So we see the same thing about the fee and the frequency of arbitrage. So if there's more arbitrage opportunities, again, we see that with the private market, the fees drop a lot. Why? Because again, for the same reasons, the miners get some of the value of these arbitrage opportunities and then subsidize the public market so that these public users can participate, and that's good for the public users. So we also look a little bit at the data and we try to quantify, is this a thing? How big is this? And how many private transactions are there? And we look essentially at two measures. So one is that we look at the ordering of transactions in the pool. So it should be that if you think about this in a very naive way, it should be that the miner would put the transaction with the highest fee first, and then transactions with lower fees towards the end of the block. In Ethereum, it matters whether you're at the beginning of the block or at the end of the block, and we should expect this to be true if we believe that this is just an auction type of mechanism. So what we see is that this is not true in practice. So here's block 6,000,003 in Ethereum. And what we see is at the beginning, there is a bunch of transactions that have essentially 0 fees, which should not be at the beginning of the block. So after these transactions, we do see that the higher fee transactions come first, and then the lower fee transactions come towards the end of the block. But what we are interested is in these transactions that are at the beginning. And why are they at the beginning? Because these are private transactions that were submitted directly to the miner, and where there was a payment made to the miner that is outside of the regular fee structure in Ethereum. So we look at the fraction of blocks that have some unconventional ordering, and we see that in the longer run, towards the end of the sample, about 70% of the blocks on the Ethereum blockchain have an unconventional ordering. So that means that this minor extractable value is a thing, and that transactions are not just ordered based on fees, that there's more going on than we would think. The other thing that we are looking at, the other way we're trying to identify private transactions is by unusual fee payments. So one way users can pay the miners is to attach a fee to the transaction. But that fee gets paid to the miner whether the transaction works out or not. So if you are an arbitrageur and you found a great trade that makes you $100,000, you're not going to attach a fee, a $90,000 fee to that, because if your transaction fails, you lose $90,000 without making any money. So the way that arbitrageurs usually pay miners in these private transactions is through an internal transaction. So you have your Ethereum transaction that executes the trade, and as part of that trade, you trigger a transfer of Ether to the miner in a private transaction within your Ethereum transaction. So we look at these these internal transactions and the transfers that users make to the miners. We can see who is the recipient of this this internal transaction transfer, and if this is the miner, then we record that payment. So we also try to distinguish between good bots and bad bots. So a good bot transaction is usually one transaction. So we can think about an arbitrage. You found an arbitrage between different dexes and you're going to execute on that, or a loan liquidation where you found an under-collateralized loan and you're going to liquidate that loan. And so that is typically one transaction. The bad bots typically have three transactions. So if you think about the front-running transaction, you see the bot buying the token, then the victim buying the token, and then the bot selling the token. So we very often have three transactions in a row. So we look at these patterns, and we find about 4,700 good bots that initiate about 700,000 trades, transactions on Ethereum, and we find about 1,200 bad bots that initiate 358,000 transactions. So what we do see is that good bot activity is kind of increasing over time and dominates bad bot activity. So here's a little picture on that. So you see in orange the good bots and blue are the bad bots. So at the beginning of our sample, we saw that the bad bots outnumbered the good bots. And here towards the end, we see that the good bots seem to dominate the bad bots. So what you can see from this picture is how much was paid in a day to miners. And what we find is that these payments are pretty significant. So we see about $500,000 towards the end of the sample per day is being paid to miners as part of these private settlement transactions. So overall, this is a fairly large amount of money that's being transferred here. It's also rare to see a blockchain paper with a happy ending. So here the good bots seem to dominate the bad bots. And so while this world seems to be all bad and everybody's out there to maximize their own payoff, we do see that it seems that the good bots are winning. So I mean, we have some picture on the how concentrated is this bot activity. So here we find that there's very few pretty big bots that pay a total of over $9 million in these private settlement transactions to the miners. And then there's a long tail of other trading bots there that are behind. So what that tells us is that there is some kind of sophistication in these trading bot activity. So it's not trivial to program such a bot and to let it trade. So there's some expertise that's involved in that. I'm going to skip this. And since my time is up, I want to conclude. So arbitrage, when we think about arbitrage in finance, we usually think that's a bad thing. So here, I want to argue that arbitrage can be good or bad. These bot activities can be helpful for society or bad. So there is a clear relationship between this arbitrage activity, fee levels, and minor extractable value. So this private settlement can set lower fees for ordinary users because the money that these miners make from the MEV transactions in a way cross-subsidizes the ordinary users on the blockchain. How much welfare loss do we have? Well, that depends a little bit on the ratio of good bots versus bad bots. And that is an empirical question. And we hope to convince you that there is more good bots than bad bots. So in a way, this is somewhat socially desirable. So this is a pretty big market, and I think it will stay. It's been growing over time, and we'll see how that affects future settlement and fee revenue for validators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alfred. Do you have questions?
How can one avoid the system avoid concentration? Because I mean, you build the best bots, you make it very large, you make it more efficient, you save money, and you become one bot in the market.
Yeah, very good question. I think that's certainly what we see in the data, that this bot activity is very concentrated. And I think we will see that probably go up over time, where there's some shops that hire the smartest people to program the best bots, and they will win. Yes, so we will see concentration. Now, we don't have really a stance on whether this is bad or not. So I don't think this is necessarily bad, as long as these bots are there and execute these arbitrage trades. That's good. Somebody needs to do that. Whether they can, I don't think that they can really have any kind of market power or something. But there's certainly concentration risk. If that bot would have an outage for some reason, then all of a sudden there would be no arbitrage transactions anymore, and that would be bad. So, but there's probably operational risk, but I don't think that it really matters from a social welfare perspective, how concentrated bot activity is.
Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions, one on the empirics and one on the theory. So on the empirics, could you provide a little bit more color on how you divide between the good and bad bots? And on the theory, have you also considered extending the model, for example, with the mechanism where if the fees increase, then also the size of the arbitrage opportunities could increase?
Okay, so two very good questions. So let me first answer the second question. So we have not thought about that, but you're right. Obviously, as market participation increases and as we have more of the private value traders, that means that arbitrage opportunities increase too. So in that sense, I think that would just strengthen our results, because what we find is that with MEV and with private settlement, we see that there's more market participation. And if that increases arbitrage opportunities, that would just increase MEV, and therefore we would have here a positive feedback effect. The second question is that we do this that we distinguish between good bots and bad bots in a relative naive way. So we look at bad bots mostly at the sandwich attacks, where a victim gets sandwiched between two bot transactions. And so that would be a typical front-running situation. I think that is most of the bad bot activity that we see out there. Is this a perfect measure? Of course not, but most of the good bot activity we can think about is typically one transaction. So this could be some back running, where I see that somebody trades on a DEX and then moves the price out of equilibrium and I push it back, or a loan liquidation, that would be one transaction. So these would have a different pattern than your front runner type of attack. But is it a perfect measure? Of course not. But we try our best to distinguish this.
Thank you for the presentation. So have you thought about like what's the impact of running multiple private mempools? Like PBS nowadays, they can have multiple relayers and each of them can run their own private transaction market. What's the impact on fees? Do you think it's the same as the old flashbots single relayer model, basically?
Yeah, so if you have multiple relayers, if there's competition between in the private market, we have not thought about that at the moment. So that would certainly bring the fees down in the private market, and that could mean that the fees in the public market for the ordinary users would potentially then go up. So that would, in a way, reduce the amount of cross-subsidization.